Spectator magazine, and he is strongly in favor of leaving the EU. Good to have you on our show. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you.
What are the principal reasons, do you think, that Britain should leave the EU?
Well, my own view is simply that we are better off as a country being in control of our own destiny and of our own affairs. And the campaign has basically come down to that question on the Leave side, taking back control, as opposed to the Remain side, whose principal argument really is an economic one, which is by no means to be sniffed at. But I think a lot of us feel the economic argument to be wildly overstated, and that in essence, being in control of our own destiny may well mean uncertainty. Many things mean uncertainty at the moment. The whole of the EU is a whole patchwork of uncertainty. But the key thing is to retain control of our own affairs. And for me, at any rate, that's the overriding matter. But the campaign has had every imaginable aspect of both sides thrown out.
When you say control of our destiny, what do you mean? Control of what?
Well, the principal issue is, and you have actually heard this in the campaign from some of the Remain camp, among others, the notion that, by the way, you hear this from the Labour left occasionally, who sometimes say we need the EU to protect us from the worst of a future Conservative government. That sort of lets out something that is actually slightly true, which is that the EU is effectively an anti-democratic buffer between the public and their representatives. It's increasingly hard, I would argue, and have argued for a long time in modern Britain, to find people to be accountable for anything. People go to the polls, they go to the polls to elect their MPs, a very small portion of the public also go to elect their MEPs. But the whole principle of knowing who you're voting for, what they can do, how you can get rid of them if you find them to be responsible for something you disagree with, is something I think that has to a great extent dissolved in modern Britain. Many of us aren't happy about that. We prefer a system which was more transparent, which was clearer, where people had to take responsibility for mistakes they have made. But this core democratic problem, to my mind, and that of many leavers, is at the heart of this. That the European Commission, in particular, is a body that has unparalleled power on the continent, and at which we have too little representation, never will have enough representation, and that we are better off as ourselves, as a sovereign nation. And people say sometimes on the Remain side, it's unfathomable, what you're letting yourself in for. And, many of us feel that Britain before 1975, when we entered the common market, before 1975, Britain was not a negligible country. It won't be a negligible country afterwards. We could wish and will wish the rest of the continent very well, but there is no need for us all to be governed by the same political class.
And very quickly, you mentioned the term EPs. What's an EP?
I think I said MEP.
MEP.
Sorry.
Thank you. I beg your pardon.
Mm-hmm. Members of the European Parliament.
Right.
Very, very highly paid representatives who absolutely nobody in Britain could name.
Okay, once again, Douglas Murray with the Henry Jackson Society and the Spectator magazine. Jeremy Clift is with us, political editor and columnist for The Economist. That's in a magazine that's very much in favor of Remain. Jeremy Clift, good to have you on our show.
Hi there.
What do you say to what we just heard, that Britain was fine before 1975, it wasn't negligible at that time, that yes, there might be uncertainty if it withdraws from the EU, but nonetheless, it's time to retake control?
Well, I don't completely disagree with what Douglas had just said. Britain obviously could survive outside the European Union today, just as it managed before it joined the European community. But I think that's in some ways a false choice. We at The Economist have come out very confidently for Remain, not because we think that Britain could not survive outside the European Union, but because we have what we would like to think is a realistic view of the modern world. And I think, in some ways, Douglas sets up a false choice in his distinction between democracy and European cooperation. Our view is that a fundamental aspect of democracy is power. It's no good being able to have a say on something if you don't have authority over it. And the way we see things, you can be sovereign, but North Korea is sovereign. It's a country that is not interfered with by other countries. It's a country that does not have to meddle with other countries' matters. It's a country in whose matters other countries do not meddle. Our view is that it's much better to have power. Power is about whether you can influence your environment, whether you can influence the choices that are forced on you by international circumstances. It's power to be prosperous, power to be influential, power to set your own terms in the world. And I think that distinction between sovereignty and power is at the very essence of the cause for the general argument to stay in the European Union. Well, and that's why, though we accept that the European Union is very much imperfect, we're for Remain.
Douglas Murray just said, though, that the MEPs, the members of the European Parliament, don't have any power. Nobody even knows who they are. Or excuse me, I guess he said that they have power, but they're not accountable to the people who elect them.
Well, it's true that the European Parliament is an imperfect institution, and we at The Economist have criticised the European Parliament in the past. But just as a measure of the power that MEPs do actually wield, any deal that Britain does, if it even votes to leave the European Union, will have to be ratified by a majority of the European Parliament. So the idea that it's an irrelevance is obviously nonsense. But ultimately, there's a lot of talk about the European Union being undemocratic. And it's true that the European Union democracy is imperfect. Not enough voters know who their MEP is, not enough members of the European community understand the processes that they are subject to. But ultimately, the European Union is a product of three institutions. There is the European Parliament, which is directly elected. Now, I admit that I wish those elections were more dynamic and that more people knew what they were doing when they voted. There is the European Council, which is a body made up of elected European governments, and there's the European Commission, which is appointed by those two previous elected bodies. Now, obviously, this does not work as well as we would like it to, but the idea that Europe is some sort of dictatorship is obviously rubbish.
All right, you both talked in a fairly high-minded way about this campaign. Let me go back to you, Douglas Murray. Neil Farage, the campaign manager for the Leave campaign, did a poster with a winding queue of refugees titled Breaking Point, obviously warning about immigration in a way that a lot of people thought was bigoted. Was that did he go too far?
Well, if I may just very quickly reply to the previous point, particularly if I may on the North Korea issue, neither I nor I think anybody else involved in the Vote Leave desires Britain to copy North Korea. I've been to the Hermit Kingdom. I can assure you that its isolation is very much self-chosen. Britain, after leaving the European Union, does not intend and would not become a hermit kingdom. We would not shut ourselves off from the world, and our Prime Minister would not represent Kim Jong-un. We would be a dynamic trading nation as we have been throughout our history. We would be looking out to the world. We would be looking to trade with the world. We would certainly not be looking to cut ourselves off from it. But as for the question of immigration, it's a very, very important one because throughout this campaign, it was a very interesting dynamic. It started with the Remain camp led by the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, every day beating the British public with scare stories about the economy, some of which may be true, some of which may be untrue, most of which I think many people agree, even from the Remain side, are very overstated. And then that dynamic changed because Leave started to talk about immigration. And if you look at the polls in Britain, going back for 20 years, the number one issue, and if not number one, always very close to number one, has always been immigration, of the top concern of the British public. Polls show up to 70% and sometimes higher of the British people worrying that immigration to the UK is far too high and they want it reduced.
Jeremy Cliff, back to you. I'm sorry to interrupt, but back to you with The Economist. We're running out of time here before we need to go to a break. To what extent does immigration have to do with Britain's history as a colonial power?
Well, look, I think that immigration is obviously a very big part of this debate. And I agree with Douglas that there are many in Britain who will vote leave on Thursday because they do not want Britain to take in more people. But I must point out that a big part of this campaign has been built on a lie. You know, the tabloid newspapers in particular, the Leave campaign to some extent, and, you know, even the main political parties have long traded on the lie that Britain is being overrun by immigrants and that those are immigrants who come here not to work or to contribute to society, but to claim from the welfare system. And that is patently nonsense. But as to what this has to do with Britain's colonial history, you know, I particularly object to the sort of conflict that is being set up by the Leave campaigners between Britain engaging with its neighbourhood, between Britain being a fundamentally European player that has a voice at the European table, and Britain being a global player that can engage with the Commonwealth, that can engage with its former colonies, that can engage with India, parts of Africa, parts of the West Indies. And I must say that, you know, you speak to any of the leaders of those countries, of those Commonwealth countries, you speak to any of the leaders of what many on the Leave campaign talk about as the Anglosphere, from Canada and the United States to India and Australia. And they are people who say, you have to stay in the European Union.
Okay, I'm going to have to interrupt you as well because we do need to go to a break. Warren Olney back with To the Point, talking today about the debate over Brexit, the departure of the nation of Britain from the European Union, a subject up for vote this coming Thursday. One event that has occurred, a tragedy that has apparently affected the campaign, was the murder of Jo Cox. She was a member of Parliament and a supporter of Remain. Douglas Murray with the Stay campaign, back to you. Did that, do you think, have an impact on voter sentiment, if not the arguments themselves?
I think it almost certainly did. It's an extremely complex as well as tragic story. But if you look at polls last week and this week, I think it's impossible not to agree that the quite right hiatus in campaigning that occurred after this clearly favoured the Remain camp. That was for all sorts of reasons. There was a momentum behind Leave immediately preceding this murder, and that was stalled to a great extent by the hiatus in campaigning. I should stress, though, I mean, there is a very careful but nevertheless present attempt by certain members of the EU political class and some in the British political class to politicise this murder in a way which is very troubling. Almost immediately after the killing, before we knew anything about it, one of the members of the European Commission said this was because of Jo Cox's support of the EU. Chancellor Merkel immediately said that this was an act of political hatred and asked for people to campaign more responsibly. Now, when they said that, when Chancellor Merkel said that, I'm sure she wasn't thinking of her colleague in the heights of European power, Donald Tusk, who said, of the European Council, I should say, who said just earlier that week that a vote to leave could signal the end of Western political civilization as a whole. Now, that you would think was very high rhetoric and rather irresponsible rhetoric. There has, I don't doubt, been irresponsible rhetoric on all sides, but it's very interesting that when Merkel and others have said what they've said in the wake of this killing, what they're really trying to say is, we've done nothing wrong ourselves in terms of campaigning rhetoric. It's all the Leave side that are stoking up public sentiment. I, for one thing, I'd say it's a very unfair thing to campaign on indeed, but it's obviously the last stage of the Vote Fear campaign is basically to suggest to the British people we should actually fear ourselves. And I, for one, believe that just as an Islamist attack in the week before the campaign should never have decided which way people voted, so we have to make sure that the assassin's veto, wherever it comes from, isn't allowed to rule in Britain or anywhere else.
Douglas Murray, once again, Associate Director of the Henry Jackson Society, Associate Editor of the Spectator magazine, again in favor of the Leave campaign. I know you have to leave our program. Thank you so much for being on it so far.
It's a great pleasure.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.